My name is Morris Zelinger, but most of the people that are still remaining my friends that are still alive and my family, most of them know me as Pip Zelinger. That name was given to me when I was about 6 years old, and it stuck. They gave it to me when I was starting to go to Cheder. And the fellas that were with me in Cheder called me Pip because I was so little. My dad and my uncle Henry, his brother, came here. They apparently had money, and in those days you could buy yourself across borders in Europe, and they ended up coming into Canada, and they ended up in New York where they had relatives, but they didn't like New York apparently, and they went to see an uncle in Omaha, Nebraska. My Uncle Henry was single. My dad had already been married, and my brother had been born in Berlin. And they ended up in Omaha. Apparently didn't like it there. They came to Denver, where they had a cousin, Benny Zelinger, the other side of the Zelinger family. And they settled in Denver. And eventually Henry married, and my dad brought my mother and my brother over here from Poland. And we've been there ever since. I was born in 1923 in Denver, May 5th, 1923. My dad was one of 5 boys and a girl. Family is 6 beside their parents. And eventually, in 1936, he brought over his mother, his father, and a brother and a sister. They were unmarried, the brother and the sister. So he brought over 4. And 3 years later, he brought over his other 2 brothers and their wives, and my cousin Marlene. She was the daughter of my Uncle Irving. So eventually he had him and Henry brought over the whole family. And he started to work on my mother's family, but Hitler had come into Poland by that time. So my mother's side, there's only 2 nephews that survived the Holocaust. And they're both gone now too. So they accomplished quite a bit by bringing all those people over. So the whole family of 6 and their parents were all here in Denver, mostly on the west side. They lived, my grandmother and grandfather originally lived with us, but eventually they had their own house on Julian Street and Irving Street, and Jack and my Uncle Jack and my Uncle Irving, they lived on the west side, and their families were raised on the west side. We lived on 11th and Quitman, right near the tracks where the Golden streetcar used to go from Denver to Golden. We lived near the tracks on 11th and Quitman. From there, we lived downtown in what was called the Catholic Apartments. It was on close to Spear Boulevard in Colfax. And later on we moved to Perry Street. Lived in the Perry apartments for quite some time. Then we moved to 14th and Perry. We rented a house there. And after a few years there, the owner wanted the house to live in for himself. So my dad bought a house on Utica Street. And I was in junior high school when they bought that house. And I lived there, and I went to college from that house. And I would live there when I got married in on Utica Street. And so I spent most of my years on the west side. The years fly by, 10 years go by real fast. But I enjoyed my bringing up there. My brother and I only had one brother, my brother David. And we had a good life on the west side. We really did. I enjoyed growing up there. We kept out of trouble, that was the main thing. Because we got raised during the Depression. All this took place in the 20s and the 30s. And Coolidge was president when I was born, so we went through the Hoover years, the Depression years. And it wasn't easy, but my uncle and my dad owned the auction house downtown Denver on 14th and Welton. And it was a good business it was a Depression business because they were selling stuff at an auction. When you do that, the stuff sells. You don't sit there and wait for somebody to come in. You're selling it all the time. So they had good turnover. It was a good business at that time. And they were partners, and they called it the Colorado Auction House. And the one experience I remember, it's cold Saturday afternoon in February of 1933. I was 9 years old, and my dad and my uncle Henry owned the Colorado Auction House on 1454 Welton Street downtown. And they had an auction that Saturday, but some fella brought in a bunch of tools. And my Uncle Henry was kind of suspicious looking at the guy and looking at the tools. So he called the cops. He felt that maybe the guy stole the tools. They were too new. The auction house was really two stores. And one side was a retail store and the other side was the auction store. And they held the auctions, it was in the wintertime, in the back side of the auction store because they heated the building from a big coal-burning coal stove in the back of the retail stores that heated the whole building. And it was like two stores, so it was cold in the front, so they held the auction in the back in the wintertime. I was 9 years old, and I remember my brother and I and Mr. Kelly, who worked for my dad for many years, were back by the stove keeping warm. And I used to sell pop at the auction for a dime a bottle. And I had a big wash tub back there with ice in it. And my uncle called the police, and these two detectives walked in, And they talked to the guy, and he came through the door between the two buildings. There was a doorway in the back that you could go from one store to the other. And they came walking into the retail part of the store where that stove was. And my brother and I, Mr. Kelly, were there. I was watching the pop, and we were keeping warm. And the cops, the two detectives, one was in front. They had the guy in the middle and the other detective behind him. While they were coming through the door into the retail part of the store, he pulled out a gun and he shot both detectives. And he went toward the front of the building and he was shooting out the windows. Now that was Welton Street. That was a main street. And he hit somebody, killed somebody on the street. And he started coming back. I saw him. He was coming. I finally decided I'd better get out of there. He came back and one of the cops, one of the detectives, shot him as he was coming back. By that time, I ran out of the building from the backside into the alley, and I went down to the corner, to the shoe shop. Sam Cohn was running a shoe repair shop on 15th Street between Wilton and Glenarm, and I went in there and told Sam to call the police because a guy was shooting up the store. My mother, who was 4'11", and my Aunt Ida were shopping at the Denver Dry Goods, which was a block and a half away. And then somebody said something about there was a big shooting at the auction house. Well, my mother heard that and she took off. I remember in those days, this was the days before they had parking meters on the streets. And the cops were not on foot, they were on horses. And one of the cops that I got to know real good was named Olson. He was a big cop, and he rode a horse. And a few times he would put me on the horse, you know. Well, he was standing guard at the door. And my mother started. He was a big guy, my mother's 4'11". Well, she went back by him like he wasn't even there. After all, her husband and 2 boys were in there. And thank God none of us were hurt. But it's something that I remember real well. And it's the first time I ever slept in the bed with my father that night. Because I was in late junior high school when that happened. I was 9 years old. Something that today you read about all the killings that are going on. In those days, that didn't happen. And it was quite a deal because it wasn't an hour after that happened, the Denver Post was out with an extra. And on the front page was a big article about 2 cops, 2 detectives being killed. Well, in the meantime, what happened, 4 people died that day in that shooting. Something. I was only 9 years old, but I remember every little thing that happened. Never forgot it, because it was such a terrifying thing to go through. It's one of the things I'll always have in the back of my mind when I think back. I think about that. Terrifying thing to go through. But we survived. And eventually, my uncle and my dad bought out my uncle and owned the store by himself later on. And during the war, World War II, he retired because the business mainly was the availability of used furniture. Well, there wasn't that much used furniture available because during the war they quit making new furniture. The factories all made stuff for the war, for the government. So there wasn't available merchandise, so my dad retired during the 40s. And he went back into business later on. But he was there for over 30 years. The building's gone now. They tore it down years ago. And they built on skyscrapers. It's on the corner of 15th and Welton Street, which was it was a very popular area downtown at that time. I went to college up in Boulder, and the government, it was and the war broke out in 1939. And in 1941 or 42, after Pearl Harbor, the government came to the students who were already in college and made them an offer that if you enlisted, they'd let you finish college. And after you finish, you had to go into the Army. So most everybody did that. We enlisted. They said we could finish. I was a junior. Well, they didn't let us finish. And they took us, in the middle of my junior year, they took me into the Army. So after 3 years, I got out. So I went in 1943, and I got out in 1946. A month before I got out, I got married, because I didn't know if I had enough points. While I was home being married, they changed the point system. So when I went back, I was available to be discharged. So about a month or 2 months after I went back, after being married, I was discharged. So in 1946, T and I came home. I was stationed in Seattle at that time. And I got discharged, and we came home, and I went back to school and got my degree in 1947. I should have got it in 44, but they delayed it, so I got my degree in 1947 and graduated. I lived across the street from my wife. I knew her from when we were kids and lived on Utica Street. She had blonde hair, long curls. In those days, the girls with the right kind of hair had curls. She had blonde hair. I remember in Colfax School, she sat in front of me. In those days, they didn't have ballpoint pens, they had ink. And you wrote with a quill pen. One day I took her curls, they were hanging, and I dipped them in the ink. Well, her mother never got over it. She called my mother and she cussed me out good. She had to cut off her curls because I put them in the ink. She had a tough time on Utica Street. There were only 2 girls, her and her cousin, Charlotte, and the rest of them were boys. Everybody on the street had boys except those 2 girls. Well, they took a beating, you know. When anything was going on, it was with the boys. And they were on the sidelines, never knowing that I was going to marry her. We used to pick on them, you know. But eventually, she attracted herself to me somehow. And we got married in 1946 in the Alliance Building on Meade Street. It was fairly new at that time. And Rabbi Lederman married us 1946. And we went back, we moved to Boulder, her and I finished school. And while I was in my senior year, right before graduation time, I got a call from the dean of the business school, and he said the United Airlines was interested in me, and they wanted to interview me. And they offered me a job as a traveling auditor. Well, T and I sat down we discussed this for quite some time. And the university said they'd let me go. They'd give me my degree. This was only about a month before graduation. They'd give me my degree and I could leave if United wanted me. Well, we discussed it, and we decided not to take the job because I'd be traveling all the time, not knowing that for 50 years I'd be a traveling salesman. That kept us from taking that job. So I didn't go with United Airlines. And I graduated in 1947, and I went to work as an accountant for a loan company in Denver. Then my dad decided to go back in business because my brother was available too. And we opened the auction house again on 22nd and Marion. And he bought the building. We had a big auction house and a retail store. But I didn't see any future in that. And I left. They bought me out, and I went on the road to sell furniture as a factory representative. And I did that for almost 50 years. My dad eventually sold the building and retired, and he died in 1980. And my brother, he went to work for Weberg's, and but he had a stroke. And he lived about 10 years after he had the stroke, and he died in 2001. And I was on the road most of the time. What I did in the Army, they sent me to OCS. They sent me to basic training at Camp Crowder, Missouri, in the Signal Corps, I remember. And I was there for basic training. This was in 1943. And they sent me to Huntsville, Texas, to Texas State University. And it was a training camp for running forts and camps, the administrative part of it. Well, anyhow, they eventually transferred me to Prince Rupert, British Columbia, which is right south of Alaska. You looked across the water and you were looking at Alaska. In fact, I took 3-day passes to Ketchikan. And I was up there for 16 months, and I was issued 16 raincoats. It rained 101 inches a year in Prince Rupert. You never left without a raincoat. And we used to wear those cavalry hats because it was raining all the time, and you never wore one of those cloth caps that the Army had. Up there, you always wore the rain hats. We call them rain hats. While I was up there, I got transferred into the S4 office, which is the supply office at the administration, top administration. And there was a captain there. His name was Captain Seif, Jewish fellow. Louis D. Seif was his name, S-I-F-F. And the table of organization for his office called for a major and a lieutenant. Well, it happened he was a captain, and I was a PFC. We were the only two in that office. At that time, 1944, Harry Truman was a senator. Roosevelt was president, but Truman at that time was a senator. And he headed the Truman Committee in the Senate. And the Truman Committee investigated the armed services for waste. The rumor came out up in Prince Rupert because Prince Rupert was originally set up to be the port of embarkation for the Aleutian Island War. And they built a warehouse on the side of a building, side of a mountain there. They built a 9-story warehouse for all the stuff they needed for an Aleutian invasion. And they built it so that you couldn't even tell it was a warehouse. It looked like part of the mountain. But it was full of stuff. As it happened, any of the fighting that was done in the Aleutians, they changed their mind and they used the port of Seattle as the port of embarkation. And they had this warehouse full of all this merchandise for war. And they built a hospital at Port Edward, which was a little island near Prince Rupert, to be the medical facility for that invasion. The invasion never happened, but the stuff was always there. The commander of Prince Rupert was, at that time, his name was Weed, Colonel Weed. And the rumor came out that Truman was coming, the Truman Committee was coming to Prince Rupert. So I remember this. He called in Captain Seif and me We were the only ones in that office. And he said he wants to get rid of all the stuff in the warehouse and on the port, only to keep a 90-day supply. Here they're ready for an invasion with all this merchandise. He says, either ship it out of here or dump it in the ocean. That's how they feared Truman's committee. So Captain Seif looked at me, he says, you go and send everything back to the depots in the United States except a 90-day supply. A 90-day supply was less than one of everything. Here they had this huge warehouse full of merchandise. I said, who's going to listen to me? I'm a PFC. And you got majors and colonels and captains in charge of all these things, and I'm going to tell them what to do. Colonel Weed said, don't worry, I'll put out an order that what you say goes. Okay, so I start shipping back. I shipped back train loads. I emptied out that warehouse. There was never more than one of anything in there. It was empty. But I shipped out train loads. So they promoted me to a corporal. At that time, a T5, they promoted me. But they sent me to OCS to become an officer. So I got a 30-day leave when it was all over, because everything got shipped out. And they sent me to OCS in New Orleans. And I got my commission in 1946 as a second lieutenant. And I was sent back, and by that time, Captain Seif was promoted to a major, and he was sent to Seattle. Prince Rupert was a subport to the Seattle port. So they sent him to Seattle. When I came home on the leave, the 30-day leave before I went to OCS, I went to Seattle. I was shipped to Seattle. And the funny part about it was, I was on the boat ready to go to leave Prince Rupert, and it dawned on me that I left my money in the bank. So I got off the ship. I told them to hold it. I'll be back in 10 minutes. I ran to the bank and got my money out. And I ended up in Seattle after the boat ride down. And at that time, Major Seif, he says, when you know you're going to graduate, not get washed out of the OCS, he says, let me know. So I knew I wasn't going to get washed out, so I called them about 2-3 weeks before I graduated. And when they were assigning our new, where we were going to go after OCS, they assigned me to Seattle. So I went back to Seattle, and Seif was there. And when I got there, the major that was assigning where we would go, all the new second lieutenants would go, he said, maybe you'll go back to Prince Rupert. I says, I just left there as a corporal. I says, I don't want to go back as a lieutenant. I says, call Major Seif. So they called Seif, and he came over, and eventually I was assigned to Seattle. I was the Port Transportation Supply Officer. for Seattle, port of embarkation. And that's where I stayed the rest of the time in the Army, which wasn't too long. I became, later on, when the war was ending, and they made Seattle a port of debarkation. They were making the port they were bringing back the troops, and they were being discharged, but they had to come through a port, so they made that Seattle one of those ports. So I became a train commander. I was bringing back the troops on trains to get discharged. I was engaged at that time to T. And I always managed to get trains that were going to Kansas or Nebraska or Colorado. And I got really familiar with the station managers, the train station managers, because we came back by train, and I had tickets to go back to Seattle, train tickets. Well, I used to change the tickets with these guys. I'd give them my ticket, and they give me a ticket that came Union Pacific. That came through Denver. And I used to come back to Denver and spend a couple of days on my way back to Seattle, because I could see T. I was engaged. Well, that worked out fine. I used to ask Captain Seif. I says, maybe I'll go up to Ketchikan to go on a 3-day pass, because I could take one of the planes that land on water, and he'd fly up there in 20 minutes. I said, I'd ask him for a 3-day pass. You couldn't buy liquor in Canada. It was rationed. So we used to get a coupon. You could get a case of beer or a bottle of whiskey once a month. It was rationed. But Ketchikan was in the United States. You could do whatever you want to up there. This was the law in Canada. So I used to get a 3-day pass. So one time I went up there, he says, buy me a bottle of scotch. And he told me what he wanted. So I come back. I was 20 years old at the time. I come back and I bought him a bottle of scotch. He said, that all you bought? I said, yeah, I didn't drink. He said, you are kind of schmuck. The next time I went up there, I took 2 suitcases, empty, and I bought whiskey. I filled up those suitcases with whiskey. The law at the time, this was in the 40s, and they made an agreement with Canada that the port of embarkation was usually port companies. Now, port companies were made up in the United States usually with colored people. They shoveled coal into the ships, Well, they made an agreement, now in the 40s, they made an agreement with Canada, no blacks. No blacks. So what the port companies were made up with Polacks and Russians from Pennsylvania. Big guys, that could handle the port. You had to be a big guy to shovel snow and shovel coal into a ship. They used to be big guys, you know. So they got all these huge guys from the East Coast, and they shipped them to Prince Rupert to be in the port companies. But they were big drinkers. They were big drinkers. And I came back with this suitcases full of liquor. And they became saleable on the 15th of the month or after. For whatever day it was, that's how much they were. In other words, it was $15 a bottle on the 15th. It was $16 a bottle on the 16th. Well, by the 15th, these guys were pretty thirsty. You know, they bought their bottle of liquor on the first day of the month, and it was gone, you know. I wouldn't put them on sale till the 15th of the month. And I was selling the liquor. They couldn't wait till I put them on sale. And they were big drinkers, those Russians and the Polacks. And I accumulated quite a bit of money that way. Enough money to buy a car when I came home. That's the money I left the ship from to run to the bank to get out of the bank. But I was actually bootlegging liquor from Ketchikan to Canada and selling it. And Seif was the one that he put me up to that. That's one of the pluses that I got as far as money was concerned. Because I was a corporal, I was getting $66 a month in Canadian dollars. A month as a corporal, $66 a month. Plus room and board. And I got discharged. But it was an interesting term, 3 years. I was 19 years old when they took me in. By the time I got out, I was 22. And I was married, and it was a different life altogether. But I must have aged 20 years. Because I was a kid when I went in. I was a man when I got out. And with what I knew about the Army, to get commissioned was something that wasn't too common. Yeah, I really wasn't an Army man. But I did something that they appreciated, and they rewarded me by sending me to OCS. And most of the guys that graduated with me from OCS, this was during the time of the Battle of the Boer. Most of them were sent to Germany to fight. At that time, it was serious. The Battle of the Bulge was something that where if you weren't an infantry trainee, you were in big trouble, because that's where they send all these guys. They send them to Camp Lee, and from Camp Lee they went to Germany. I was fortunate that I knew Seif, and when I called them and told them I was going to graduate, that's when they made the works that I go back to Seattle because of him. He probably put the word out. So I was fortunate in that part of it. After that, I went to work. Mark was born. We lived in an apartment on Grant Street, and Mark was born in 1948. And we eventually moved to Willow Street, and from Willow we bought a house on Hoffman Heights. My father-in-law says, "How come you're moving to Kansas?" You know, Hoffman Heights was, I looked out our back window at Fitzsimmons Hospital. Well, hell, Fitzsimmons Hospital was way out of town at that time. He says, "We moved to Kansas." Well, we bought the house there. I remember Mr. Hoffman, when we went to look at the model house, he called me into the kitchen of the model house. He says, "Zelinger, buy 2 or 3. I says, "I'm afraid to buy 1. I never had a mortgage in my life." He says, "You better buy 2. I should have bought 10, but I didn't. So we lived there quite a while. Well, then we moved to the west side after my mother-in-law had her stroke. And he wanted to be closer to her because she was an only child. And so we sold the house in Hoffman Heights. And we moved back to the west side. And eventually I bought the house on Vrain Street. So I spent all those years selling furniture. And in the 1960s, in fact in 1962, my folks went to Israel. They had never been on an airplane before. In 1962, they were traveling to Israel. While they were gone, in the summer of '62, I was coming home from a trip in southern Colorado, and in the afternoon, on a Thursday, a clear, beautiful day in Pueblo, I got hit by a semi-trailer, and he drove my station wagon into the uprights of an overpass, and I ended up in the hospital. This was on a Thursday, and T and Mark came. They flew down to Pueblo. I got out of the hospital, and a week later, my folks were coming home from Israel. Well, I didn't have a car. In fact, I had a cast on my leg, and I had my forehead was all scarred up because I hit the radio loudspeaker, and that imprinted on my head. When I got out, and when we picked up my folks at the airport, my wife was driving her car. And I remember my dad was sitting in the back seat, he said, and she was driving. He said, "You had an accident, didn't you?" And I said, "Yeah." Well, he knew she was driving her car. She never drove when I was in the car. Well, eventually I got that all settled. And he knew right away something had happened because it wasn't normal that she would drive when I was in a car. They enjoyed that trip. In 1981, I made the biggest mistake I ever did. I drove Cadillacs, and I used to trade the Cadillacs in. I ended up, in 50 years on the road, I drove 18 Cadillacs. in 1981, with the gas deal and everything, they talked me into buying a diesel. So I bought an Oldsmobile 98 diesel, but it wasn't a true diesel. It was a converted diesel. Biggest mistake I ever made. It used to get down to 20 degrees, the car wouldn't start. And I used to have to go get a mechanic all the time to get the car started. And I was in Torrington, Wyoming, and I called my wife every night when I was on the road, and I told her I was coming home and I'm going to get rid of this damn car. I said, every morning I get up, I can't start the car, and it's not even freezing. Well, I was in Torrington, and I remember I was going to be home that afternoon, and it was kind of misty, but it wasn't bad. And about 20 miles out of Torrington, on the way between Torrington and Cheyenne, I was driving, and this farm truck is in front of me. And the farm truck, they have accelerated high beds, And I go to pass him up, and while I'm passing him up, he turns left. And he just sheared the top of my car off because of the high bed. An old man, a farmer, and the cops came. And they asked me what happened. I said, I would go to pass him. He didn't signal he was going to turn left. I said, and while I'm passing him, he turns left, and I go underneath him. So the old guy says, I always turn here. That's my farm. So the cop said, this man is not from here. He don't know you're going to turn left. He says, everybody knows I turn here. Well, as it happened, Dave Goldstein, my wife's cousin, was the insurance man at that time, and I called him, and he got me a check for the car from the insurance company. And I remember going to Rickenbaugh to Richie Cohn, and I says, here, they gave me a check for $17,000 some dollars for a Cadillac, for the Oldsmobile. I says, here's a check. You give me a car. You know what kind of car I want. He says, I got one here for you. It was a blue Cadillac. So I went back to buying Cadillacs after that mistake I made with the Oldsmobile. But I didn't have to trade it in. He wrecked it for me. So I went back to the Cadillacs. But I gave him the check. I said, I'm not giving you no more. This is what I'm giving you for a car. Well, $17,000 in those days bought a pretty good car. This was in the 80s. So the cars, compared to today, were kind of inexpensive. But $17,000 was a lot of money in those days also. I bought a Cadillac. So I stayed with the Cadillacs. In fact, I'm driving my last one. I've got a 2005 or 2004. That's the last one I bought. And that's the last one I will buy. I'm still running it. And it's a very good car, and I take care of it. But that was the last accident I had, was with that farm truck. It was so funny when he says, everybody knows I turn here. 1973, I was in Scottsbluff, Nebraska, and I was planning to come home that night. It was a Thursday. And I had an appointment on Friday in Greeley at one of the furniture stores. And I got a late start out of Scottsbluff, and I remember calling T and telling her that I'm going to stay near Greeley, because why should I come home, get up real early, and drive back? I'll just stay in Greeley, and I won't have to get up so early in the morning and drive again. It's on the way home. I'll just stay out overnight. So I stayed in Evans, which is right outside of Greeley, at the Ramada Inn. And I called her and I told her where I was and everything. And they had a restaurant and in the front, and they had rooms, but they had two wings. From the front, they had two wings, 2 stories high. I was on the second floor of the left wing. And I always parked my car so that if I looked out the window, I'd look at my car. That time I was driving the brown Cadillac, I remember. And I always slept I put the quilt over my head. And I didn't hear well, I don't hear well. I didn't hear well then. I left a call for them to call me to wake me up in the morning. I got up and I looked out. It was dark out. They had black window shades. And I went over and opened the window shade, and my car wasn't there. I looked out, no car. I went to turn on the lights, and there were no lights. I wondered what the hell happened. I blew my nose, and like soot came out of my nose. While I was sleeping, the motel was burning. The front of it was all gone already. And there was one person was killed. The restaurant part and everything was burned out. I got up and I got dressed in the dark, and I come down the aisle, the hallway. I went downstairs, and on the way downstairs, a fireman met me on the way down. He says, "How'd you get back in?" I says, "I never left." He says, "You were supposed to be evacuated." I says, "I just left the room for the first time." I says, "Where's my car?" Oh, he says, "It's couple blocks away. They hauled all the cars away." I said, "What happened?" He said, "The place burned." Here, the whole front was gone. It burned out. And what I was involved in was the smoke. And nobody knocked on, if they knocked on my door, I didn't hear it, But I was there during that whole fire. I was in the room. He wanted to know how I got back in. I said, "I never left." So I slept through that fire. I was president of the Furniture Club at the time, and I remember I wrote to the president of the Ramada Inns. I think their office at that time was in Phoenix. And I told them what happened. See what they would do. And I told him I was president of the Fern Club, which is a membership of almost 200. And I'm sure a lot of them stay at the Ramada Inns. Well, he sent me back a nice letter and said he was sorry the place burned. That was all. Well, I called Gil Goldstein, the attorney. He said, "Did you get hurt?" I said, "No, I didn't get hurt." He says, "Well, if you didn't get hurt, then that wouldn't happen today. If that would happen today and you call those ambulance chasers that are on the telephone, on the TV all the time, they make a big deal out of it, you know." But he says, if you didn't get hurt, you got no claim. Well, they don't do that anymore. If you're just inconvenienced, you got a big claim. So I slept through that fire, and nothing happened there, thank God. So I had some interesting times during the 50 years. One of the best things about that, I called on some dealers for 3 generations. I'd start with the father, and eventually I'd be dealing with the son. And then later on I'd be dealing with the grandson. So they really were friends. I became very friendly with a lot of them. I mean, I considered them friends. You know, they weren't just clients. And I enjoyed calling on them, and I'm sure they enjoyed seeing me too, some of them. But I had very successful 50 years on the road, enjoyed it. Something I hadn't planned to do. If I didn't care about being on the road, I would have been with the United Airlines. But as it happened, it worked out fine. He finally got sick, and she died. In fact, today's her yahrzeit. She died in 2002, and I've been alone now for 17 years without her. We were married for 56 years, which was very good. So I'm thankful I'm still here. Had good years, good long life. I just turned 96, so I feel very fortunate that I'm still well, and I can still drive, and I can still take care of myself and my business, whatever I have to do, I can do it. She and her brother don't believe it, but I still can do it. They always want to make me an invalid. But I'll be all right until time comes. It's been a good life for me. I've got no qualms about that. I've been very fortunate. I was with Serta for 15 years, selling mattresses. In the late 60s, or middle 60s, Manny Kramer, who was the sales manager at that time, he hired me, and he said, "We'll give you the North Territory," which did not include Denver. North, Wyoming, Western Kansas, and the Panhandle of Nebraska. It was a territory where they did at that time maybe $75,000 a year business. He said, "You can take that territory." We didn't have a written contract. He says, "As long as you do the best you can, you can keep the territory. It was a verbal agreement between him and I. I kept that territory for 15 years. In the meantime, he died. And they brought in another sales manager who happened to be with Sealy Mattress at the time. His name is Bruce Taylor. And I worked my butt off, and I got that territory up to $1 million. And then during that time, the king-size bed came into being. The first time they ever made the king-size beds were in the 60s. But I worked hard. To go from 75,000 to $1 million, you don't do that overnight. Well, I was on commission, straight commission. In 1979, Bruce called me in. I had just got off a trip. I came in on a Friday, I remember. And I had a lot of paperwork to do, and I got it all done. He kept telling me he wants to talk to me. So finally, right before lunchtime, I got through with all the stuff I had to do, and I went in there, and he fired me. Well, I know why he fired. I was making too much money. See, it was okay if I worked my butt off and didn't make anything, but it wasn't okay if he had to pay me. Well, I went to Gilbert, I remember, and I said, I just got fired after 15 years. He called me the next day. He says, I'm going to bring suit against them. He says, I got information about them that they don't know. We went to court, and I went, and he said, we'll sue him for $135,000. He says, you figured that you're going to lose about $250,000 in 10 years before you can make it up. So we'll sue him for $135,000. Carter was president at the time. And the interest rate was crazy. The legal rate of interest at that time was 11%. Well, we went to court. This was in 1979. We went to court, and I won. And I won $135,000 plus 11% interest. And they appealed. When you sue in the district court, it's a local deal. But once it's appealed, it becomes published, and everybody in the country knows about it. They appealed to this court, and I won that. In the meantime, Gilbert, he says he'll take the case, but he'll charge me. He says, I won't charge you what I charge my regular customers, but he says, I'd already paid him. He charged me $5,000 after the first session, and I gave him the $5,000. He won in the appeals court. They appealed to the Colorado Supreme Court. They appealed it. In the meantime, I'm getting a $135,000 judgment plus 11% interest. In 1984, This is 4 years later. The Supreme Court refused to listen to the case and upheld the previous judgment. And I was awarded $200 and some odd thousand, $205,000, which was the original $135 plus the interest. The interest was something like $75 a day. I was in Kansas, and I was on my way home. It was September, because it was going to be Rosh Hashanah pretty soon. I remember it. And I get a call. I know it's from my wife. She's the only one who knows where I am. She calls me. She says, "When you going to be home?" I says, "I'll be home tomorrow night." "Gilbert wants to see you." I says, "What for?" "Well, the Supreme Court won't listen to the case. They upheld the other court, and they want to pay you because the interest is going on at 11%. I said, "You tell them I'll be home tomorrow night." So I got home on Thursday, and I went to see Gilbert Friday. I think Rosh Hashanah was Sunday. And he had all these papers for me to sign. And I'd already given him another $5,000, so I'd already given him $10,000. Now this is 4 years. This is a terrible thing to go through, to something like that to last for 4 years. And I'd signed all these papers. And on the bottom, the last paper is a bill from Gilbert. He charged me another $10,000. For 4 years' work, he got $20,000, which was kind of cheap. And he had a check there for $205,000, which I told him, I says, "Have your partner deposit it because it's going to be Yontif and I won't be able to go to the bank." So that was published. And he started getting calls, and I started getting calls from all over the country. I asked the legal advisor in New York to the IFRA, the salesman's organization. He says, "You don't have a chance to win this." He says, "Forget it." Well, Gilbert says he don't know who we're dealing with. Well, when I called him later and told him I won the case, he says, "I know all about it already." He said, "It was published." He says, "I've been getting calls because right after the verdict came through that the Supreme Court wouldn't listen to my case and upheld the lower court, my company sent me a contract." He says, "A lot of the companies, because of your case, are now issuing written contracts that you can be terminated without cause." I had no contract. Mine was verbal, and the guy I had the contract with was dead, so they had no case. The only case they had was that I was making too much money, which was no case at all. One guy called me, he says, "I'm going to sue him for $1 million. I said, "Sue him for $10 million. I said, "Put him out of business and you'll get nothing." I said, what are you suing for $1 million? You don't even make $1 million. I said, "If you'd be reasonable." And in fact, the judge asked me at the time, I remember, the first judge, He says, if you figure you're going to lose $250,000 over a period of time, and you're suing for 135, how come? I says, at 11% interest, 135 is going to be worth more than 200 at 11%. And it was. He wanted to know how come I was suing for so little compared to what I said I was going to lose. Well, it turned out to be in my favor. So that was something that was very satisfying as far as I was concerned. And it made big business, it made big news as far as the representatives were concerned, because any suit that was usually brought up was usually lost because they had termination at will. And I didn't have such a thing in writing, but I sure did the day after the term. And I took it to Gilbert. I said, they want me to sign this. He says, it's in their favor. They wrote it. He says, I wouldn't write it like this, but he says, you got no choice. Signed it. So I signed it. I still got fired. So that was something that was very satisfying for me, was to beat them out of a court case. I worked till I was 82. And I enjoyed it. It was a good life. It was okay. You didn't want for anything when you were growing up. And I bought this place in 1975 at a song compared to what it's worth today. And I'm all right, I guess. I'm nothing to be sorry for or anything. My brother was bar mitzvahed in he was bar mitzvahed in 32. In 1932. He was bar mitzvahed in December 32, and I couldn't go to his bar mitzvah because I got the mumps. I remember that. I had an acute appendix, and I'm about 11 when they operated on me. Took my appendix out. That time it was a big deal. Stayed in the hospital for a week. Today they take your appendix out and send you home. They fixed my knee. They operated on my arm. I had a double hernia. I had the woman's disease. My left breast was cancerous, and they operated on me. I had the operation. And it was successful. I didn't have to have any chemo or nothing. Doctor said, don't let them touch you. It didn't get to your lymph nodes. And that was it. Never had anything to do with it anymore. They removed my left breast. I had plenty of cutting, but I survived it all. Yeah. My wife's cousin, he's gone now too, Pincy Berger. He was in school in Boulder when I came back from the Army and went back to Boulder to get my degree. He was in school at that time. I think he was a sophomore. And I had time on my hands because I was taking some courses for no credit because I didn't need the credit. What I needed was 2 courses in accounting to get my degree. So, but I had to take so many hours. So I took some courses for no credit. So I had plenty of time. So we decided, him and I sat down one day, we decided to sell cheese sandwiches to the students in the dormitories. My wife's uncle had bought my father-in-law's bakery, and he owned the bakery. So I could get the bread from him. He could ship it to me on the bus every morning. And we made cheese sandwiches. And we went to the dorms. And we sold cheese sandwiches for so much a sandwich, which was not right. First of all, we didn't have permission to do it. Second of all, you don't serve food with no license or anything. But we were selling cheese sandwiches. T would make the sandwiches and we would sell them. They finally caught up with us. And they said, you can't do that. You can't be going into the dormitory to sell food. But we did. And we did that for some time. We made pretty good money. But that came to an end. But we had a good time doing it. And he gave something for T to do during the day. She could make the sandwiches. We bought a couple baskets, carrying deals, and we go to the dormitories and sell sandwiches. I don't know, but we'd get 50 cents a piece or so, whatever it was. It was enough to make pretty good money because we got the bread plenty cheap. And one thing it was fresh. It was real fresh because we got bread every morning on the bus. Busted up from Denver. A lot of fun. I was a Phi Sig, and when I came back, they had the Phi Sigs we had a house, but they bought another house. They bought the Sigma Chi house, so they had this empty big house. They used to house, 40, 50 people. Well, I was coming back to school, so they let me stay in the house. I could live in the house all alone, just her and I, in this great big house. Well, had rats. I remember I went to class, I came home, and T is out on the porch, on the front porch of the house. And I could tell she had been crying. I said, what's the matter? She said, I'm not going back in there. I said, what? They're rats. Well, there were rats. There were rats when we lived there. So we moved into the hotel. She would stay in the house. She says, I heard noises, and then I saw one. That was it. She never set foot in that house again. I remember it was in May, and it was probably in 1940. Let's see, they took me away in 41. It was either in 42 or 43. We had a spring formal, and next to our house, the fraternity house, was a big empty lot. It wasn't a lot; it was lawn, but it belonged to the fraternity, and it was enough room there to build another house. It was part of the property. Well, we had a portable dance floor that we put up every year. And it was nice, really. We had the room, and we had the guys that were in engine school that could put down that floor and make it level. The dance floor. And I remember that year I was the social committee chairman. So it was up to me to get things going for the dance, the orchestra and everything. And we set up the floor. It was in May. Some guy came by during that week before the dance, came by in a big truck full of tulips. He's selling the tulips. And he wanted so much, a dozen. I said, I'll tell you what. I said, why don't you go sell what you can? And when you're all through, come back. He did. He came back. He sold off about a half of it. But he had so many tulips. I gave him $25 for all the tulips that he had left. And we had tulips all over the place. Decorated that floor it had a little lattice fence around it. And we had all kinds of tulips. And it was the middle of May. And I was coming home. It was going to be on a Saturday night. So I came home and I picked up tea on Saturday to go back to the dance. While we're driving to Boulder, it started to snow. And here I had all these tulips all decorated on the floor. I had tulips in the fraternity house. Everybody had tulips. Well, we always rented the dance floor at the university just in case. Well, we never used it except that year. And I remember we took all the tulips up to that dance floor. Everybody had tulips. And they blamed me for it. They blamed me for the snow for stealing the tulips, paying them $25 for all these tulips. I think that was the first time it snowed in May in a long time. And that's why it snowed, because I bought the tulips for nothing. My mother lived to 98 years old. 98. She outlived my dad by 13 years. She broke her hip turning over in bed. That's how brittle she got, you know. She turned over in bed and broke her hip at 95. They operated on her, and she lived through it. She never walked again. She was in a wheelchair. But the doctor said, if we don't operate, she's going to die. So they operated, and she lived another 3 years. We had a cousins club made up of 8 cousins. My wife's 7 cousins. My wife's cousins, first cousins. There were 7 of them. And we had a cousins club, met once a month for 20 years. We met once a month, and we always looked forward to it. It started out with dinner, ended up with snacks, because it was too much work for as you got older. And we used to play gin. The men against the women. And we had that cousins club for God knows how long. And always look forward to it. So David was the first one that died, right? Then T. There's 5 of us left out of the 14. And I'm the oldest one. Yeah. But we had some good times. We had some good times together. And we always looked forward to that once a month meeting. Just the kibbutz. The kibbutz more than anything else. Had the good memories. We had good times. I remember I called on a dealer, Benny Steller. He owned Spear Furniture for many years. And I went to see him. I called on him occasionally. And I used to see him on Saturday nights. We used to go down to the Brown Palace Hotel on Saturday nights to have dinner and dance, because they had the orchestra and everything. And he was always down there with his wife. And in 25 and 46, 71. 1971, he dropped dead. Young. He wasn't old, but he wasn't young either. But he's a young man, comparatively. He dropped dead. And it really shocked me, because he was always telling me where he was going to do, what he was going to do, you know. And I used to see him like every Saturday night at the Brown Palace. And he dropped dead. At that time, I owned some stock in Continental Airlines, and I got a letter shortly before he died saying they were going to have a stockholders tour. And the tour was to Hawaii, and it was going to be, the people that are going to go are going to be flown on the first flight of a superjet to Hawaii. The big ones. First flight. And it was 10 days or 2 weeks for $600 a couple, which was quite a bit at that time. But I came home, I got that letter, and I sat down with T. I says, we're going to Hawaii for our 25th anniversary. I says, Benny Steller kept talking about what he's going to do and where he's going to do it and how he's going to do it, and he dropped dead. He didn't do anything. I says, that's not going to happen to me. We're going to Hawaii on our 25th anniversary. And we did. We went, we had a hell of a good time. It was a flight that I'll never forget, because it was the first flight of big flying fortresses. We had a good time. They flew us to San Francisco, and they put us up in San Francisco. And I remember I had a cousin that I hadn't seen in many years. I got hold of him, and him and his wife and T and I had dinner in San Francisco the night before we left. Then we flew to Hawaii. We had a good time and flew back, and on big planes, and really enjoyed it. But talk about doing something on the spur of the moment, you know. Just because he dropped dead, I got to go to Hawaii. So but that we enjoyed. And we went to Hong Kong, and we went to Spain, and went to Africa. We saw quite a bit while we were married, besides me not being home all the time. But we had a good marriage, and it lasted a long time. And that's the end of my story.